Hello everybody, welcome to this afternoon's festival session, part of Insight 2020. So if you've been involved in the festival so far, you'll know that this is a 6-week virtual festival designed to share learning across the NHS, local government and various different partners. So I hope you've been able to join some of the sessions up till now. As you know, we will be recording this session so that people who haven't been able to make it will be able to see that later. We won't be recording comments and we won't be recording your video unless I think you show your camera when you're speaking if you ask a question. So please be reassured that you can remain anonymous during the session this afternoon. So my name's Alison Turner. I work in the strategy unit and I'm leading on the evidence and knowledge support within the Decision Support Centre, which is serving the Decision Support Unit network in the Midlands. And so the purpose of today's session is just to share with you some of our reflections on how we might understand what we currently know to inform decisions and share with you some of our thinking, some of our ideas. And importantly, to get some of your reflections as well. So we hope that you'll be encouraged throughout to share some of your thoughts and comments and questions. There'll be a few points where we'll be asking you for some input, but please do feel free to share any comments and questions through the chat box. Each of the weeks during the festival has a central theme. So the theme for this week is the role of the Decision Support Unit network. And as I say, we'll be focusing on the evidence and knowledge aspects. And towards the end, I'll share with you some of the other sessions coming up this week. So there are some really interesting sessions that I'd highly recommend. So without further ado, we'll start with some housekeeping. Oh, bear with me. I just need to move, there we go. So please, can we ask you to keep your microphone muted during the session? Any technical problems you have or any questions you want to ask, just use the chat button, which I think should be at the bottom of your screen. I mentioned that we'll be recording the session and we will share links with you afterwards, so you can take a look later. If you're on Twitter, please can we encourage you to tweet about the sessions that you're joining during the festival. We've got the hashtag Insight 2020 and our strategy unit Twitter name. Is it Twitter handle? I'm never quite sure what we call it. But please do get in touch with us. And if you are watching this recorded version later and not the live version, at various points we'll be asking you for input. So please do tweet any reflections that you have because we'd be really interested in hearing about them as well. So I'd encourage you to do that. So just a little short introduction to who you've got with you today. So there's myself, Alison Turner. We also have Richard. I don't know if you want to say hello, Richard.
Hello, everyone. I'm Richard Ward and I work as a research assistant at the strategy unit as part of the evidence team.
Great. And then making sure everything works beautifully behind the scenes, we've got Gareth as well.
Okay, thanks, Alison. Yeah, hi, I'm Gareth Wrench. I've actually got two roles. So I'm working within the strategy unit as a programme consultant to help initiate and get the DSU network up and running. And then my substantive role is actually working with Public Health England, where I'm the Associate Director for PHE's Local Knowledge Intelligence Service in the West Midlands. Great,
thank you. And both Gareth and Richard will be involved in the Decision Support Unit network quite heavily over the coming months. So for those of you involved in that network, you'll see all our faces quite regularly over the coming months. I also want to mention Shona, who unfortunately couldn't be here this afternoon, but Shona is a key member of the team as well, doing evidence and knowledge support work for the Decision Support Unit network, and has also been involved in a lot of the thinking that we're sharing in the slides today. If you were on the call yesterday afternoon, you might have heard Peter mention about some early work on eye health, which Richard was involved in doing the evidence work for that. So just a little plug there for Richard. And also just to mention that we're really happy that Gareth has been able to join the team along with his colleague Janine from the East Midlands, because I think it helps to strengthen the links between public health and the NHS. And I think when it comes to evidence analysis and knowledge mobilisation, I think there's an awful lot to be learned from each other, but also to share some of that material and avoid some of the duplication, but also innovate together. So we're really looking forward to that collaboration. Okay, so what I'd like to invite you to do now is just to say hello, introduce yourselves, tell us who you are, where you're calling in from today, what your role is. So if you could just invite you to do that through the chat box, that would be a great test to make sure everything's working for us. But it would also be lovely to just get a sense of who's on the call today. So I'll just pause and give you time to do that. And I also have a small task for you today. So I'd like to ask you to share your views, because part of the value of a session like this is to actually get some different perspectives. So I'd really like to encourage you to share your thoughts, ideas, comments, or any questions around what an evidence-informed, knowledge mobilising and evidence-generating network, how that looks and feels to you. There are no right or wrong answers here. We're really just interested in hearing different perspectives, because I think that will help us to shape our thinking and I think just help us with some of our priorities over the coming months and where we might focus some of our efforts. So please do share your reflections in the comments box. And if you're watching this as a recorded version, please do share them via Twitter, because we'd be very interested to hear them. Okay, so I think we'll move us on now. And I wanted to talk about evidence-informed decision-making and some of the reality around that. And you'll notice I've said evidence-informed rather than evidence-based, and that is deliberate. I think the term evidence-based I have a slight problem with, because I think it suggests kind of simplicity and maybe a sort of linear process, which doesn't bear true in reality. And I think evidence-informed recognises that there's an inherent complexity, I think, in how we can use and apply evidence and knowledge to our decisions. The source of decisions that we're talking about in the decision support network really inevitably involve some kind of value judgment. So I think evidence is a part of that process and knowledge is a part of that process, but actually there's an awful lot to be juggled, hence the picture of juggling plates. So there's a lot of tensions and trade-offs to be recognised in the decision-making process. And evidence is sort of part of that, knowledge is part of that. And what I'd like to sort of share with you today is some of our thoughts about how that might work. And we really recognise some of the difficulties and some of the challenges around that, and some of the issues with using evidence in commissioning, for example, or in public health, and that it's not a straightforward process. It's kind of messy and iterative and complex. So that's part of what we want to explore with you this afternoon. And I guess really what we're looking for most of the decisions that we're talking about is really how best to use a finite set of resources, how we're going to use those resources to improve outcomes and demonstrate cost effectiveness, and also thinking about the experience for patients and communities as well. So there are all these factors to bear in mind, and that's really, I think, why it's such a complex and messy process. So I'll move us on. And I guess really, as part of this juggling of trade-offs and tensions, it can be tempting to take some shortcuts, but of course there are no shortcuts on the road to success, as this picture demonstrates. But I think what feels like a shortcut at the time actually may end up taking a lot longer, because what we've done is not make the most of what we currently know, and maybe introduced waste or harm or missed opportunities. So we're not going to get any silver bullet answers from using evidence and knowledge, but we will get valuable insights. And that helps us to understand what's likely to work in different types of context, for different patient groups or different population groups, and also how and why. So it goes beyond effectiveness evidence, thinking about, what are the mechanisms of change, what seems to work, and why it seems to work differently in those different contexts. And I think also evidence can help us weigh up the potential benefits and harms and some of the opportunities, because whatever we invest in, there are always going to be opportunity costs. It means we are taking money from something else or taking resource from something else. So the investments we do make, we want to make sure make the best use of that resource, and we're not going to introduce harm, or we're not going to just get some very marginal benefits at the cost of other opportunities. And also, I think the important thing about evidence in decision making is helping to challenge some of the myths and assumptions that are made. Some of the assumptions are made that are quite hidden and unconscious, and I think evidence and knowledge mobilisation can really help to uncover some of those assumptions and to make that more explicit so that we can understand how we're basing our decisions and what information we're basing them on. But also, I think importantly, particularly in the light of the current pandemic, I think evidence and knowledge are very important for helping to support new developments and new initiatives, innovations, and understanding what we currently know about how things work. So importantly, I think, and I'm probably preaching to the converted here, but it really can't be left to chance. And this diagram I really like. I think it really encapsulates beautifully the sort of challenges or some of the issues and consequences around poor uptake of evidence and experiential learning, so some of our knowledge. So, you know, we could see there that as we pass through that sort of pipeline of evidence through to care, that as insights are lost and evidence is poorly used and the experience of patients and staff is poorly captured, each time we're losing opportunities to improve outcomes, we're potentially introducing waste and potentially introducing harm by not making the most of what we currently know. And I think we see that through evidence being poorly communicated, or if it's not fully understood, and some of the sort of timescales that we're dealing with make it really challenging to systematically look at some of what we currently know. So part of what we want to talk about today is how we deal with some of those challenges. So I'm going to hand over now to Richard. Richard's going to just run through a very quick quiz with you, just to share some insights from public policy.
Thank you very much, Alison. So as Alison said, we'll be doing a very quick quiz where I'll read out a description of 3 social policy interventions or initiatives, and then invite you to post in the chat box whether you think the programme was effective or not. So indicating Y for yes, N for no, and U for whether you're uncertain. So to kick things off, the first is the Scared Straight programme, which was designed to discourage at-risk children from committing crimes by providing them with first-hand experience of prison life and interaction with adult inmates to avert the risk of them becoming offenders. So interventions included in this were prison visits, the prisoners delivered presentations to the participants. There were tours and extended orientation sessions within the prison, such as living with a prisoner for 8 hours. So the question is, do Scared Straight and other juvenile awareness programmes reduce the rate that participants commit crimes in the future? So I'll ask you to indicate yes, no, or uncertain in the chat box. I'll just pause for a moment to give you guys a chance to reflect and submit your responses. There we go. And it looks like there are no's across the board. Yeah. Would you be able to move the slide on, please, Alison? Thank you. So the next centres around restorative justice conferences. So these aim to bring together offenders, victims and others involved, so families and communities, in order to discuss the impact of the crime and how the offender might repair the harm done by it. So in this review, conferences are generally face-to-face. There's a trained moderator there and all parties have consented to participate. So typically, the offenders committed a violent crime or property crime, and these conferences are offered as an alternative or to supplement the prosecution process in court. And now we've got a fair few answers coming through. Fantastic. Looks like a few mostly yeses, an uncertain, another uncertain. It's fairly unanimous. Just give it a few more moments for more responses to come in. There we go. Would you be able to move the slides on, please, Alison? Thank you very much. So the final question, I suppose, is around mindfulness-based stress reduction programs. So these programs were developed as a way to relieve stress and help individuals cope with physical and mental illness. So these programs are typically offered to people with chronic pain, from illnesses such as cancer, or for mental illness, including symptoms of anxiety, depression, or stress burnout. So the standard programs generally last for 8 weeks, with 2-hour weekly sessions and a final all-day session. So it typically involves practicing mental and physical awareness with techniques such as neutral body attention scan, where participants typically lie down or sit and simply observe the feelings throughout their body. Generally, participants are taught to use focused breathing to maintain this whole body awareness throughout the day. So the question in this, I suppose, is do mindfulness-based stress reduction techniques, are they effective in reducing rates of anxiety, stress or depression or not? I've got a few answers coming through here. It's largely yeses, a few uncertains. I'll just give another moment for a few more to trickle through. It's like the last of them. Would you be able to move the slides on, please, Alison? Thank you. Thank you for participating. So we're now displaying the answers effectively, or giving an overview of the 3 Campbell collaboration reviews that these judgments are based on. So you see from the first on the top left that scared straight programs actually result in more crime. So evidence from around 9 US experimental studies has shown that these interventions cause more harm than doing nothing, with no positive evidence supporting their effectiveness. And further analysis of 7 studies has actually demonstrated increased odds of offending for both juveniles and adolescents through these programs. So the second in the middle essentially shows that face-to-face restorative justice conferences are cost-effective and reduce reoffending and increase victim satisfaction. So this evidence comes from a systematic review of 10 studies demonstrating reduction in subsequent crimes among participating offenders when compared to standard criminal justice or court processes. So the data on cost effectiveness comes from 7 UK studies and shows that the value of benefits from crimes averted by the programme is around 8 times the cost incurred by delivering these restorative justice conferences. And the final, for mindfulness-based stress reduction, it shows that this training improves health and quality of life for adults. So this comes from a review which summarised around 101 randomised controlled trials with around 8,000 participants across the USA, Europe, Asia and Australia. It showed moderately large effect sizes on mental health, somatic health and quality of life, including social functioning, at post-intervention when it was compared with an inactive control group. So one of the interesting findings from this programme was that if around 100 people go through the MBSR programme, it's estimated that around 21 will have a favourable mental health condition compared to if they've been put on a waiting list. So I suppose to give an overview of this activity, referring back to the lovely diagram that Alison displayed, I think on slide 8, the significance of this activity is that it shows that, you know, this evidence has been assessed and yet where there is evidence to support the effectiveness of the intervention, such as restorative justice conferences or MBSR, how widely do we see these programs being implemented? And on the other hand, despite evidence of tangible harm from programs such as Scared Straight, there is still calls for these programs to be continued. We call these zombie ideas because even though there's evidence of their harm or ineffectiveness, they keep coming back like the undead. So most crucially, these examples demonstrate to us why it's important to understand what we already know before investing our money and resources. So I'll now hand back over to Alison, who will speak around the importance of building learning cycles into these processes. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Richard. That's great. Thank you. Yeah, so as Richard mentioned, the there's a sort of, I suppose, a cyclical approach to looking at this in terms of building evidence into these learning cycles. And many of you will be familiar with the plan, do, study, act cycle, and variations on that. And within the knowledge management sort of sector or profession, there is a sort of recognition of this sort of learn before, during, and after cycle. And different sort of tools and techniques. Oh goodness, let's move on. Different tools and techniques to use at different stages of that process. So you know, before we start a project or a program or a major decision making process, we're trying to understand what we currently know. So what have we learned from what has happened before? And there are different techniques that people use for this. You might have heard of before action reviews or pre-mortems. There was some interesting literature a while ago about a process called peer assist, where the Formula One team, I can't remember which one, came and worked with Great Ormond Street Hospital, helping them with their theatre handover, because there was something about learning from the pit stop process that actually helped to inform how they might hand over more smoothly and avoid errors. And then during a programme, there's something around actually how do we use evidence and knowledge in a way that will help us to course correct if things aren't going wrong. And certainly with the sort of systems thinking approach that you'll have heard about from other festival sessions, there is that sort of approach to sort of making adjustments as we learn more about how an intervention or an approach or an initiative is sort of being implemented, I suppose. And there are multiple different tools, again, after action reviews. They've been used very extensively within University College London. And there was a series of articles on that, I think, called Life in the Slow Lane. And they were used very effectively to look at what they could do in terms of correcting or minimising errors and maximising organisational learning. And there were some really interesting aspects there around organisational culture as well. And there are also techniques like knowledge cafes, fish bowls, different ways of getting people to share what they know, and communities practice also are very good ways of sharing and dealing with problems. I think one of the issues around using some of these tools is avoiding perpetuating bad practice. And so I think there have to be, I guess, tests of any claims that are made. We need to then think, actually, is there evidence for that? Do we have data to back that up? And generally, we'll come on to it in a while, but we're looking at using multiple different sources of evidence. And I think when you look at those in total, I think you make a much sort of bigger picture. And of course, I think there's something about having the discipline within health systems, health and care systems, to share what we've learned with others and actually identify what new questions emerge as a result of our iterative cycles. And again, different tools and techniques for this. So the retrospect is a really helpful way of really a systematic way, I guess, of understanding what we've learned during a programme or project. And knowledge assets are really just ways, so that's often briefings or webinars or different ways of sharing that learning and capturing it much more systematically. And we'll be talking a little bit about how we'll be using knowledge assets within the network. Now, I mentioned about the systems thinking approach. Now, this is quite a busy slide, so I hope it's kind of clear enough there. But this is the Cynefin framework, which was developed by David Snowden through his work in looking at knowledge and how that works in terms of making decisions and taking actions. And he looks at the different kind of contexts in which we might be making decisions or taking actions. And really is referencing the fact that these different contexts require different kind of responses. So in this simple quadrant, we have, for example, best practice. So, for example, we have nice pathways, nice guidance that tells us what to do, because it tends to be quite straightforward. And there's generally consensus in the evidence base about what is the effective approach to improving outcomes. If we move into the sort of complicated area, I think here we're sort of tending to look a lot around effectiveness evidence to inform decisions. And so some of the areas that we've been looking at recently are around, for example, outpatient reform, and some of the alternatives to face-to-face clinics, and obviously that's become even more in demand since the start of the pandemic, and that's kind of forced the issue somewhat. In the complex environment, this is where it's I guess much more unpredictable. So we're using these sort of iterative cycles much more to guide our actions, because it's almost impossible to determine what the outcome might be, and there are all kinds of unintended consequences to some of the actions that we might take, or some of the decisions that we might make. And so what we're looking at in this sort of scenario is really how we can use evidence and knowledge to inform those rapid cycles of improvement, and thinking about being able to be quite flexible and adaptive in how we help to make sense of what the evidence is saying, and what we currently know from our own experience as well. And this is quite challenging, because for people who have working in evidence, I think we're all used to having a little bit more time to search for and gather and make sense of the evidence. And this sort of complex decision-making environment adds a sort of different kind of element to that. And so we're having to continually balance the sort of timeliness and rigor aspects to be able to deliver a sense of what we currently know in a good enough format to inform decisions, and then sort of keep track of that and keep renewing that process through cycles of learning. And then I guess we've also got the chaos element there, which perhaps represents, the early days of the pandemic, when everything was new. We were learning about the virus, we were learning about the impacts on different people, and we were trying to learn from what had happened in other countries, which, completely different contexts. And so we're getting some quite different messages from the evidence. And actually, the volume of evidence has been overwhelming in terms of COVID, and I will touch on that in a little while, but it's certainly been an interesting few months. So this is quite just a helpful lens of looking at, what might be needed in different types of contexts in terms of evidence and knowledge. What we'd like to do now is just do a sort of run a quick poll with you. And what we're specifically asking you about is, what barriers and challenges do you face in finding and using what we currently know from research and practice to inform decisions? So this might be in general, or it might be in relation to a particular example that you've had it recently. And I'm just going to see if I can bring up the poll. No, that's not going to work. I might have to get Gareth to do the poll, because I can't seem to find the button. Here we go. Thank you. So can we invite you to pick, and I think you could pick multiple selections, but which of these resonate mostly with you in terms of what barriers and challenges you've come across? Now we might have, we've only listed a few there, so if there are any other challenges that you come across frequently, or that you've come across recently that aren't listed there, do just add them into the comments box, into the chat box, sorry. And I'll just give you a few moments to respond to that. And perhaps if you're listening on the recorded version of this talk, you might like to sort of play along and just have a quick reflection of some of the challenges that you face. Okay, so we're starting to get a few responses through. So I think, and what seems to be coming out as the top response so far is not enough time, which is certainly sounds familiar. And there's also quite a few responses for too much evidence, don't know where to start, and don't know what I can trust. And I think that just shows just how messy it can be, and how sort of overwhelming it is when people have got quite a lot of other things to be doing as part of their day job. So I think that's probably all the responses we're going to get. So shall we end that? Shall I just... There we go. So if we share the results. So I think everybody can now see the results. So not enough time is definitely top of the poll there. And we're definitely getting something around too much evidence and not knowing where to start and what to trust. I think we might have a few comments in the chat as well. So perhaps I'll just pause there and check with Gareth and Richard if there are any comments in the chat that you have picked up.
Just a couple of comments in the chat there, Alison. So something from David Atherton around, yeah, poor or no alignment of workload and resources. I think we can probably relate to. And then something else from Francis, where she's saying that decision makers, yeah, need time, energy and confidence to make changes based on evidence. It's probably a useful reflection as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think both those comments really highlight the value of a kind of networked approach to this, because I think certainly, so within the strategy unit, we have sort of, I guess, 3 of us currently focused mostly on evidence, with a few others sort of doing evidence alongside qualitative work. And you know, even with that small team, it can be quite difficult to you know, generate lots of evidence work given the number of questions that are emerging. And I think the experience is similar across other sort of similar organisations, like Commission of Support Units, for example. Some CCGs, I think, have evidence roles and knowledge roles, and I think similarly, obviously, in public health, there are various different teams. And I think in public health, they're probably more coordinated than in the NHS. But I think there is something about actually, you know, if we were to look at that capacity in total, we'd probably be able to address an awful lot more together by collaborating or coordinating efforts than working individually. And there's probably quite a bit of duplication currently. So I think the network approach is really interesting because it gives us the opportunity to share some of that work, but also to sort of, I guess, share resources and ideas, but also perhaps to do some innovation together about, you know, what methods might we use to work in these sort of rapid cycles, and you know, how can we exchange some of that information much more explicitly. So that's really helpful. Thank you, everybody. I'll just move us on to talk about some of those challenges. So if I just, there we go. So some of the pitfalls along the way, and you might have seen this diagram elsewhere or slightly different, but I think in our heads, we all like to think when we use evidence and knowledge, that it's like the top diagram, that it's like this nice linear path and straightforward. But as soon as we start looking for evidence and knowledge, we hit the reality very quickly. And we've you know, covered some of that in the poll. The fact that, you know, time is really short in short supply. People are juggling multiple different things. But as well as that, you know, we often, what we find is we are either overwhelmed with evidence and there's just absolutely loads to deal with, or there's hardly anything. we never seem to find a sort of nice, neat, manageable amount. But so I think there's something about information overload, information poverty. You know, we also can get burned through to our own confirmation bias. It's very easy to unconsciously look for things that confirm our own worldview. And I think that there's some benefit in getting some kind of evidence support, because it brings a little bit more objectivity and takes away some of the potential bias, I think. You know, as well as that, we've got conflicting evidence quite often, and then it's working out what to do with that when you're getting multiple different mixed findings that you know, it's hard to quite make sense of. And it can be tempting, I think, to take shortcuts, but that does risk missing evidence. And I think there's something about acknowledging, I think, that, you know, that we have to make the best use of what we've got in terms of the poor quality information, the gaps and uncertainties, but there's something about just being explicit about where those gaps are and where those uncertainties are and the limitations in the evidence base, because you know, even if you think back to if you're familiar with evidence-based medicine, you'll be familiar with the hierarchy of evidence, which sort of suggests that the systematic reviews at the top are consistently good quality, but we know that bad quality systematic reviews exist, and so there is something about just being aware to that. We don't have time to critically appraise everything we read, but we can apply some quick tests to test some of the claims being made and understand what we're dealing with. We probably don't have the luxury, I don't think, of always looking for, the top high quality evidence, because sometimes that just doesn't exist with the type of questions that we have. Let's just move us on. So yes, I think this is just part of the volume of evidence, and I think, interestingly, I read something not so long ago from a blog in Nature that estimated scientific literature grows about 8 to 9% every year. So effectively every 9 years it doubles. And this is a really nice quote from Charles Friedman looking at the biomedical knowledge generation, and it's from 3 years ago. But he and his team were estimating that, oh gosh, I seem to be on automatic moving forward, sorry. He was looking at the doubling time of biomedical knowledge. So back in 1980, it was 7 years, and by this year, he estimated 73 days. So it really is no wonder that we're feeling overwhelmed with information, because there's just so much out there, and that's not taking into account things like social media as well. So there's an awful lot of just stuff that we're dealing with, and so hopefully the network like this is an opportunity to think about actually how do we deal with that collectively. So just a reminder to share your reflections on what evidence-informed knowledge mobilisation and evidence-generating networks look and feel like to you. This might be, because I'm going to move us on shortly to what we're thinking about in terms of the decision support network. So it might be an opportunity to just check if there are any questions in the chat box at this point.
We have had a couple of questions, Alison,
yeah.
Just related to some of the previous remarks that you've made. So there's one from David Atherton, who asks, who thinks the last 5 years has seen improvements in patient health, demonstrating that NHS leaders have the required capabilities and skill sets. So is there a learning cycle for the NHS?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because I think one of the some of the literature I've been looking at recently is around this concept of learning health systems and having a sort of systematic approach. There's almost like a cycle where it starts with some kind of trigger, and whether that's recognizing that there's some variation in service delivery or similar, or there's a variation in outcomes somewhere. And then there's a sort of systematic process of understanding why that is by looking at the data, what the analytics is telling us, what we might know from evidence and practice, and then having some collective process for doing that. And I think that this was something that started out, I don't remember if it was the Institute of Health in the US, but they were suggesting that there were different sort of learning cycles. So you almost had them stacked on top of each other, and some might be long term and some might be very short term cycles. And I thought that was an interesting sort of concept. But I think it's difficult because of the capacity issues in the NHS, and I think it's a sort of slightly different context. But there's potentially something to learn there about what we might learn from that and to inform, I think, the decision support network. And particularly, I think this opportunity to look at things collectively. And I think one of the things that I'm most excited about for the decision support network is the chance to integrate more what we learn from the analytics and what the evidence and knowledge is telling us, and what we know from the experiential learning, for example. Because I think for a while, I think we've almost been working a little bit in silos, and I think there's an opportunity to sort of inform each other's work a lot more. So, for example, where the evidence can help to inform some of the models that might be being looked at, for example, around COVID at the moment, and similarly, the analytics can help really focus the scope for some of the evidence work that we do, because it can always sort of say, actually, narrow it down and saying, well, this is the kind of thing that we're interested in. Because I think one of the challenges we found with evidence work is quite often the scope is so broad, it ends up being so high level, and I think the analytics work can really help to focus it down, as in, understanding what is particularly relevant in this context.
Okay, thanks, Alison. Yeah, we've got another good question from Khadija, who's asked, yeah, how about when the evidence shows that a programme has no impact but it's politically driven? How do we as practitioners address this with decision makers?
I think that's really challenging, actually, and I think it's something around building this sort of culture where that can be challenged, and I often wonder whether one of the sort of strategies for that is really helping our public and our patient involvement members and our local communities to sort of challenge evidence in a way as well, because I kind of I understand the question, because I think it can be that voice can get lost within the system a little bit, and I wonder whether we can be doing something to help our patients and public to challenge more around that. But I think it's a case of demonstrating some of the sort of potential harms, and so whether that's harms to patients or the fact that it's indirect through missed opportunities and wasted resource. Sometimes it's not always, I suppose we're reliant a little bit on that being reported well. But I think if we're able to sort of articulate that impact in terms of some kind of numbers in terms of the impact on the local population or the impact financially, I think that can often help.
Okay, there's another more of a comment here from Sarah, but she's just remarked, yeah, it'd be good to have a cohesive locality-based evidence doc that all partners could sign up to, or at least agree. And then there's a final question from Sigal, who says, I find that no matter how many times we do something, we cannot rely on the answer when starting out on something new. Stakeholders will always distrust what others before elsewhere have done. How do we get beyond this obstacle to use the existing evidence?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, actually. And I think there's something about recognising or contextualising, I suppose, the evidence, because and then this is kind of a little bit of an issue with the evidence base itself sometimes, because that contextual information isn't always shared. And so sometimes, when you say, but this hasn't really worked in I don't know, say Newcastle, for example, and people go, oh yes, but we're different. But I think sometimes that contextual information isn't captured in the study, or isn't shared and published in the information that's available. And so it can be very hard to show what is transferable and what is what isn't, I suppose. And so that's part, I think there's a bit of an onus there on researchers to perhaps share more of that information, so that we can understand, actually, is that context so different that actually maybe it will work in a different context. But then I think it does raise the argument that if there is evidence that there may be some harm or unintended consequences, then I think it just raises the priority of evaluation much more. So, for example, with Scared Straight, people are still saying we should try that programme, and I spoke to somebody from the Ministry of Justice not so long ago, and they were saying it just keeps coming back. But I think then there's a responsibility that if you're putting forward a programme or initiative or an idea that has been shown to create harm or waste or missed opportunities, then there's an onus to evaluate that really well and to check and to have systems in place to monitor that impact and unintended consequences. Because there's a responsibility to the local community, to the population, and to the taxpayer, I think, for the use of resources. So I think there's something about, there's an onus on researchers to include that information and context, but also I think the business case has to be really sound for implementation, and it prioritises evaluation, definitely.
Okay, David's just come back that he agrees with Sigal, and just mentions that poor relationships and a bad history between, for example, commissioners and providers has created this sense of fake news potentially.
Yeah, and there is this sort of, I think this is. Well, I mean, I am obviously biased because I work in a team that does provide this service, but I think sometimes having that objective look at the evidence does help to address the argument that evidence has been cherry-picked to support particular arguments. Because I think one thing that we're very clear on is that we should always look for something to disprove the theory of change. So if we're asked to look at something, then we will consciously look for evidence to disprove. Yeah, so I think that's an important thing. And to understand, I think, this is partly as well where qualitative evidence can be particularly useful, because it perhaps reveals aspects of the impacts that may not come through in the quantitative data.
A few other sort of useful comments, but just conscious of time with about 15 minutes to go, Alison. So
sure. Well, I'll just speed through the next few slides, because it's really just sharing some of our ideas so far. So so I won't go into too much detail, but yeah, so here's our sort of our knowledge mobilization strategy or approach, if you like, is sort of based on these three elements that are sort of mutually reinforcing. So within the network, we will be generating new insights. So we'll be creating evidence and knowledge, we'll be curating it, and we'll be connecting people together and connecting people to the knowledge. So these are all reinforcing activities. And then we've got some keywords below, but just to keep, I guess, to remind ourselves of really how we should be working. So, and there's two words there I really want to pull out in particular. So actionable, I think everything we do should be around, informing decisions, and there should be some kind of actionable insights from that. So nothing that's really overly abstract. And it should be sustainable, because the idea of the network is it shouldn't be reliant on any one element of the network. It should be able to be sort of self-sustaining, I think. So these are the sort of, this is the overall approach that is sort of, I suppose, the framework for how we're working. These are just some of the benefits. I'll actually skip over this slide, because these are just some of the benefits of working collaboratively. And I don't think I need to repeat this, because I think we've probably covered some of this already, actually. Now, next week, I think there's going to be some sessions on the analytical priorities for the network for this year. So each year there are going to be 2 to 3 questions that are looked at in detail, in depth, and that they're questions that are relevant to the whole of the network. So these are the areas that we're looking at this year, and this is just sort of our evidence cycle. But going back to some of the points that we talked about, the sort of being able to make sense of the evidence in a sort of to inform some of these rapid cycles of improvement. We're experimenting with evidence maps this year. And this example, I would have done a live demo, but I thought it was tempting fate too much. But this example is a map that's Shona developed for the COVID pandemic, over the summer, to inform some of the decision making, looking specifically at the impact on inequalities. And this is an approach that we're kind of inspired by the humanitarian sector, because the International Rescue Foundation, I think it's called, the organisation headed up by David Miliband, they have come up with evidence maps as a way of helping people working in conflicts and disasters to see very quickly what evidence there is on different aspects of their response. And so this is just a way of using frameworks to sort of organise the evidence base. So in this example, we've got different aspects of inequalities and then the different impacts. And Shona's done a really very clever thing with pivot tables in Excel, which just means that you can very quickly filter the evidence, so that you're just looking at the portion of the evidence base that you're interested in. And I've seen this represented visually as well, so you can almost you get a sort of size of the evidence base, but also a sort of indication of the types of evidence. So it'll give a sense of how much of that is review literature, how much of it might be service evaluations, and so on. So this is something that we're experimenting with, and I've got the link there to the evidence map, so you can get a better sense of what that looks like. And then, if you click on one of the cells, so you might be interested in, I don't know, for example, the impacts of COVID response on people with disability, and you can just click on that cell and it will come up with some relevant studies. I'm not sure how well you'll be able to see that, but then it just brings up a sort of almost like a catalogue of evidence, and then the idea is then you can drill down into the individual papers. So it's initially just a way of organising the evidence, and then at some point I think when we hit certain points of the decision-making process, then we can look at the aspects that are most go into informed decisions and do a quick summary of some of the key messages there to inform decision making. So yeah, we are using frameworks much more to sort of structure the evidence base, and this is just an example of the WHO's integrated care framework. So this is just quite a useful way, I think, of looking at some of the implications of different decisions or interventions. So yeah, this is just our sort of way of looking at just trying to make sense of the evidence and organising it in a way so that when we are asked to support key decisions, we can generate that evidence base really, really quickly. I'll just mention a couple of things about what we're offering the network. So we'll do evidence reviews on behalf of the network. So we could produce maps, we could do signposts, which are very, very short turnarounds of pointing people to particular policy and guidance and some of the key reviews. And then we do scans, which are sort of shorter 2-week turnaround type of reviews, and then through to much larger scale reviews where we're starting to look at much more detail, more sources, for example. And we have a set of values and our standard practice just to guide how we work there. So I'm not going to read through those, all of those for you, but you can see the sort of thinking that's shaping the way that we work. And oh dear, I've got loads of animations here, sorry. So I mentioned about the hierarchy of evidence. So we found that isn't overly helpful for the types of questions that we do. So we've, you might have come across Mark Pettigrew's paper, Horses for Courses, where he looks at it in terms of a typology rather than a hierarchy. So the type of question you're asking informs the sort of evidence that you're looking for. And so we tend to, look at quite a blend of different types of evidence. So we tend not to just focus on review literature and quantitative literature. We tend to bring in service evaluations, lessons learned reports, and so on. So we're looking at effectiveness, but also mechanisms of change, for example. And I think that the nicest analogy for this I've come across is John Gabay and Andre Lemay. They've done a lot of work on practice mind lines. And they use the analogy of a compost heap. So you're throwing in all these different sources, which on their own, they might not stand up to, they might not look particularly rigorous, but actually when you put them together, you end up with this sort of very rich compost at the end. So, you're blending all of these different types of evidence to get a really clear picture. And almost like, a jigsaw puzzle, you're never going to get the full picture from evidence and knowledge, but you might get some pieces, some key pieces that help you to understand what's in front of you. There's also, and I think Mohammed is going to be talking about this next week or possibly the week after, a learning and development program. So we will be offering some skills development through finding evidence sessions. So things like formulated questions, where to look for evidence, searching some of the bibliographic databases, but also some of the tools for knowledge mobilisation, some coaching and advice as well. So all of that will be shared with the network at some point soon. I think probably from about Christmas onwards, we'll start to deliver some of those sessions. And then I just wanted to finish with a brief description on our knowledge library, which is on the new website. And this is sort of based on the concept of knowledge commons. This is a picture of a commons not far from where I live. And it's really trying to get across this sense that this library, it'll act as a collective memory for the network. But importantly, it's based on this principle of a knowledge commons. So it's really trying to set up from the start a shared responsibility for maintaining that library. So we all have our sort of responsibility for sharing via that library, but also sharing to a certain standard. So we have some standards and some guidance to for people to include and share details and information through that library. So the idea is that it will gradually develop as a sort of first port of call to check if anybody's done some work on this before, and it will help with framing and conceptualizing some of the key questions that we're looking at. So I'll just mention very briefly the standards. So these are draft at the moment. So, any comments we really welcomed, either today via the chat box or later, get in touch with us. But what we're trying to do is set out inclusion and exclusion criteria, some publication standards, some way of tagging the information so that it helps with discovery, but also things like appropriate Creative Commons licenses so that people can share information according to some agreed principles, and that things like clear provenance information, because it's surprising how much comes out of NHS and other public bodies that doesn't include the date, for example, which is always really frustrating when you're looking for reports and you think, oh, I've got no idea how old this is. So we're trying to set up some of these standards from the start, but any comments, again, just do get in touch with us, either mention it today or get in touch with us at some point afterwards. We'd be really interested to hear that. And I think that's everything I wanted to cover. So perhaps there's a few minutes remaining to just check if there are any other comments or questions at this point.
Can you see the chat box, Alison, at all?
Oh, actually, let me stop sharing and I might be able to see it.
They're more sort of comments rather than questions, really, but I didn't know if you wanted to pick up on any of those final comments.
Yeah, so I think, so I'm just going to, probably starting at the bottom, but yeah, so I think there's something there about literature review skills would be useful, well, and that's hopefully something we will address through that the learning and development program. But if there are specific aspects that you're interested in, do let us know, get in touch, and we can factor that in, because we, when we're designing sessions, that's always useful to know. And yeah, so it'll be interesting delivering that virtually, and I think we'll have to think about how that works with the connections and things, but I think that will be really interesting, and we can look at some of the questions live as well and test our skills. Looking at what else have we got here. Indexing the knowledge. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, because we came up with a few different tags initially for the knowledge library. And it's really challenging because we didn't want to have too, a really big controlled vocabulary, because we thought, oh gosh, that's going to be really difficult for people to just use. So one thing we thought was consistent across all the different documents was some kind of information about settings. So we thought that might be a useful tag to add, and also the type of knowledge as well. But there is definitely something about the theme, and I don't think we've quite got that right yet. So I think that's something we're going to have to think about over the coming months, actually. And definitely thinking about how we share that in a way that's useful, and not having a really massive long list, but at the same time making it easy for people to find what's useful. Okay, so I think what I'll do there is I'll probably, realizing there's 2 minutes to go, I will let me just share my screen. Let me just see, because I just want to share with you what's coming up later this week. So here we go. I need to click the share button. There we go. So tomorrow we've got Paul Mason and I think David Callahan talking about the evaluation network, which I think will be really fascinating. That'll be a really interesting one. Thursday we have Stephen Wyatt and I think Paul Seaver and Jake Parsons talking about developing the network of analysts. So again, that'll be fascinating. It's always interesting to hear from that team. They always have a really great way of describing the work that they're doing. There was another session planned for Thursday afternoon, which has been postponed because the speaker unfortunately has been pulled away to some urgent work. So I think if you'd signed up for that, you should have received an email, or you will be about to receive an email letting you know about that. But we'll be reorganising that as soon as we can. And then on Friday, there is a panel discussion, I believe, on the decision support unit and what's next. So that'll be really interesting to understand some of the ideas and thinking that's currently happening with regards to the decision support unit network. So if you're not already registered, there is a link there to sign up. And I believe weeks 3 and 4 have been shared. So I think on the website, you'll be able to see what's coming up. And over the next couple of days, we'll be sharing what's coming up in week 5. So there'll be really some interesting things. And actually week 5 does include, if you're interested in more conversations about evidence, there is a session on a roundtable on COVID evidence and some of the challenges that we found around trying to make sense of what's coming out around COVID. And we're going to be getting 2 or 3 different people with different perspectives Just confirming names, so I'm not going to share the names with you just yet, but that should be coming out in the next couple of days. And that will be really interesting just to understand some of the problems that we've had, because I think it's an illustration of some of the challenges that we've talked about this afternoon, and what that means for how we deal with the COVID evidence, because there has been just a tidal wave of studies coming out, and I think the knowledge that across organisations are learning as they're going has been difficult to keep up with as well. So that will be a really interesting session. So I think all that remains is to say thank you very much for joining us. I hope you found it useful and informative. Do get in touch if there's anything you'd like to talk about, or share any more reflections or comments. And I think at this point we usually ask people to put their cameras on and sort of give a little wave. So I'll just stop sharing my screen, and hopefully people can just sort of give a little wave, and just say thank you very much. I hope you found it useful. It's been really great to hear your comments. Thank you very much for participating.
Thank you, Nat.